Hello. Today we'll be talking about the social psychology of leisure as a field, specifically looking at the history of social psychology. The beginnings of the field happened during and prior to the 1950s. And this is when social psychologists studied human behavior in leisure settings. So they weren't actually interested in leisure, but they used recreation and leisure settings in order to study and figure out human behavior. The most famous of these psychologists is Norman Triplett, who's one of the first social psychological researchers. He did a laboratory experiment in 1898, specifically looking at cycling, and he wanted to know what the influence of cycling would be if you were alone versus if you were in a group. He theorized that cyclists would ride faster over a given distance when in the presence of others than when they were alone, even when the cyclists in both situations were trying to perform their best. So he devised an experiment where he had two groups, and some people would cycle alone while others did it in a group setting. And they were all told to cycle as fast as they could. He really looked at that, making sure people were trying to perform their best. And to no surprise, he found that in a group setting, the people would cycle faster. And that's obviously partly because it gives you a visual cue to know how you are doing. It also provides competition to be in groups. And it allows us, maybe to be more self-determined in our behavior. And Triplett called this the rabbit effect. Second famous study of an example of a social psychologist studying human behavior in a leisure setting is the Robbers Cave studies by Muzaffar Sharif. This was a large research study carried out in the leisure setting of a summer camp to study general social psychological principles. The researchers used the boys' involvement in camp and outdoor recreation activities to study the formation of norms and leadership in groups. The camp was located near the Robbers Caves, which are mountains in the southeast area of Oklahoma, and that's why the study got its name. So the Robbers Cave experiment was looking at intergroup conflict and cooperation, and by Sharif and many of his colleagues as part of a research program at the University of Oklahoma. And this was a large-scale intergroup relations project to look at psychological and sociological approaches of studying intergroup relationships. He had several hypotheses. On the next slide, I again explain these in fairly simplified terms, but this is it in more text. So the first hypothesis is that when people who don't know each other are brought together and they go through a bunch of activities to group bond, that the group will develop a hierarchical status and develop social roles within it, a group bonding. The second hypothesis is if you take two of these groups who have identification and membership, and you bring them together under competition, they will develop negative attitudes towards each other. They basically develop, stereotypes and discrimination, conflict. Thirdly, if you take two of these hostile in-groups and you bring them together under conditions of shared need and cooperation, the group will more develop positive relationships between each other. So the study had 3 stages for each hypothesis. First was intragroup formation, where they take a smaller group of boys and get them to bond. Then they presented intergroup conflict, where they have these 2 different groups of boys compete against each other. And third, They restored harmony or reduced conflict between the groups by creating non-competitive interactions. So I'll go through each of these stages so you can better understand the study. The experiment called for the selection of 24 boys who were all roughly the same. 12 years of age, from similar backgrounds, lower middle class Protestant families. They were all well-adjusted psychologically, of normal physical development, and were in the same year of school. The boys were divided into two groups, and on separate days, these groups were, I forgot to mention that the groups were balanced as possible based on physical, mental, and social talents. The individual groups were picked up by a bus on different days in the summer of 1954 and transported to a 200-acre Boy Scouts camp, which was surrounded by these Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. At the camp, the groups were kept separate from each other and were encouraged to bond as individual groups. They did this through group activities with common goals. Pitching tent, having to get something on the other side of a river and needing to canoe, etc. So all sorts of outdoor recreation or outdoor education types of activities. So achieving the goals of each of these activities required cooperative discussion, planning, and execution. As expected, the two groups of boys tended to individually generate their own acceptance of common membership and their own status hierarchies. One group called themselves the Rattlers, and the other called themselves the Eagles. And they made flags showing their names and colors, etc. The researchers then started stage 2, where they developed friction between these two groups, these in-groups. This phase was intended to bring the two groups into competition conditions. So a series of competitive activities were arranged, things like tug of war and baseball. And there was a trophy that was given to the best team as well as the best boy on the basis of accumulated team score. And the prizes were things that the boys would just love, like medals and multi-bladed pocket knives. And they made a big deal of presenting these prizes as well to the winning group, and no consolation prizes for the losing group. The two competing groups then were brought together for the very first time in the mess hall. And there was a lot of name-calling, razzing back and forth, and singing mean songs. In the days following, the groups showed disrespect for each other's flags, trying to burn each other's flags and that sort of thing. They raided each other's cabins, name-calling, etc. Now, both groups even objected to eating in the same mess hall at the same time. The researchers then started stage 3, where they were trying to bring more harmony, create intergroup harmony, and through non-competitive interaction. They really wanted to reduce the friction and conflict between the groups. So they started various socialization opportunities, a bean collecting contest, movie night, fireworks on the 4th of July. So they had several of these get-to-know-you opportunities, but many of them ended in food fights. Then they developed problems, these problem scenarios, where there would be a common need or shared goal between all of the boys as a large group to solve a specific problem. For example, there was their bus breaking down problem. There was a problem of getting a movie or film for movie night. And another one was the water drinking problem, which I'm going to explain, so you can have an idea of how they created these different problem scenarios. So all of the drinking water in the camp came from a reservoir that was in the mountains. And of course, the researchers purposely broke the water supply. So the water supply failed. The boys, that was their drinking water. They were getting thirsty. And so the camp staff said that something had happened to the water supply, and they blamed it on vandals. Both groups of boys went exploring to discover the problem. And they found a practically full tank of water with a broken outlet, faucet. The boys all gathered around, and suggestions of how to fix it were made by everyone. They worked together to fix the faucet. When the water finally came, there was common rejoicing. So what they found then was that following these different problems, there was joint sharing in the achievement, and they all contributed to the lessening of the tensions between the groups. They found that at breakfast and lunch on the last day of camp, the seating arrangements were considerably mixed. Eagles were on the Rattlers side, and Rattlers were sitting on the Eagle side of the mess hall. They all shared a bus on the way home, and they stopped for malted milkshakes. So this is a very interesting study. Also want to point out that this study would never be done in today due to the ethics involved. We wouldn't manipulate especially children in this way. Many social psychological studies that have been done, prior to the 70s, if you look at them, they're very interesting in the results they've done, but many of them lack ethics. And I'm sure you've heard of many of these other types of studies in psych classes that you've taken. But this study is a great example of social psychologists using a leisure setting to study human behavior. And the results demonstrate the importance of recreation and leisure in sport and social activities in group formation. But also this study was very important to understanding discrimination, stereotyping, and racism. Following the 50s, there was many more social psychologists who were looking at activity. And so these were specifically psychologists and social psychologists who were looking at leisure. The most famous is Mahai Csikszentmihalyi, who's a very famous psychologist who developed the concept of flow. We'll learn that in this class. Many of you might have heard about this theory, and even in sports psychology, you might hear about you're in the zone. I had the pleasure of meeting and having lunch with Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, and he really he's spent his whole career really looking at optimal experiences. There was Seppo Aisawahola, who was looking at specifically the social psychology of leisure, and really helped to develop the field, including developing journals. And John Newlinger was a psychologist who really advanced the field and developed numerous texts that started the field on its foundation. In the 70s, people started to be academics who were either people who were psychologists, social psychologists, who specifically went into departments that were recreation and leisure studies. Roger Manel was at all of these people are retired. Roger Manel was a psychologist who was interested in looking at play, and He then began in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies at Waterloo and retired there, and was instrumental in looking at social psychological principles as they're applied to leisure experience, and particularly looking at coping. Doug Kleber was a developmental psychologist, and he was very interested. He was an athlete, a football player, and so in his PhD, he had himself injured his knee and couldn't play at the elite level anymore. So in his PhD, he looked at that experience of loss to athletes and how it affects identity formation. He then worked at the University of Illinois and then the University of Georgia, where he retired. And of course, Roger and Doug are my mentors. They're my academic dads. Gordon Walker was perhaps one of the first people who did a PhD in social psychology, in recreation specifically. And he's a social psychologist then who's really looking at leisure in terms of culture as well as race. So when these researchers and others started, it also changed how we delivered recreation and leisure services. Researchers and practitioners were more just cared about, how to deliver things, like what to deliver, but not the why. So instead of just focusing on what people do, research in leisure studies started to apply psychology and social psychology to look at human behavior in order to understand experiences and what people are feeling and thinking. Early research looked at things like benefits of play, really looked a lot at outdoor recreation and specifically motivation and satisfaction. Looked at group behavior, environmental influences, and the importance of socialization. The first quiz or exam is not very focused on Chapter 2, and you'll need to know how social psychologists looked at human behavior in leisure settings. For example, you've got Triplett, who looked at cycling, and you have the Robbers Cave studies, which was applied to the context of boys' summer camp. Understand the history of the field, understanding that in the 50s and earlier, it was very early on, social psychologists who were looking at human behavior in a leisure setting, but they weren't studying leisure specifically. In the 60s, we had social psychologists who were specifically looking at the experience of leisure. And finally, in the 70s, the field of social psychology of leisure specifically emerged as its own distinct discipline. You'll now should be looking at your first reflection activity, which is on a leisure problem. All the instructions are posted on Brightspace. So first you need to get and read an article on a leisure problem. I have here some examples of problems, but you might be looking at things like people not getting enough physical activity, or parents causing problems at games for coaches or referees, children having too much screen time. Obviously, right now, there is probably many recreation, leisure, and sport-related issues around COVID and the pandemic. How to have recreation and leisure safely and how to deliver that. You're going to be summarizing what this problem is, and you're going to discuss how it is a leisure activity. Looking at, is it something you do in your free time? Is it enjoyable? Was it freely chosen? And does it have negative or positive outcomes? And how you think this problem could be solved. Please note that the article can be Canadian or from any other country. It can be from a newspaper or website or magazine. easily find something online. I suggest, pick a topic that interests you. You will be required to submit the web link or the actual, PDF of the article with your reflection activity. As long as the topic is related to something to do with recreation, leisure, sport, free time, work-life balance, then I'm sure you can find an appropriate article. So hopefully you've gotten to know a little bit more about social psychology of leisure, as well as the history of this field.